Welcome to another 3 p.m. podcast at mirrorfootball.co.uk. I'm Steve Anglesey. I'm joined today by unpleasantly a heavy cold, but much more pleasantly from the Sunday Mirror and from Mirror Football, Anthony Clavane. Anthony has written an extraordinary book. It's called Promised Land, the Reinvention of Leeds United. And I could do a very long intro about this, about how you should buy it if you're a Leeds fan, how you should buy it if you're not a Leeds fan. I certainly think it will be in the shake-up when the books of the year, football and sport books of the year are announced. Anthony, to save me further embarrassment, what is the theme of this book, and how did you come to write it?
The theme of this book is threefold. It's the theme of a city, Leeds, a football club, Leeds United, and the community within that city that I came from, the Jewish community, and it's about their fight for acceptance. So it's three fights for acceptance, and I think that the image of Leeds, the city, Leeds, the club, and to some extent maybe the community I come from, hasn't always been the most positive. But for me, it's always been a tale of trying to get into what I call the promised land, which we know in football, when we say that, and we journalists say that all the time, promised land means probably, I don't know, get into the Premier League or get into the Champions League. For me, it's always been about being accepted as part of the elite. For Leeds, the city, Leeds, the club, and my community, we've always felt as though we're outsiders. And I don't think that this book is restricted to people who are from those three. If you feel like you're an outsider, say if you're from Plymouth, or if you're from Ipswich, Yeovil Town or whatever, you are, I think, and you will identify with the theme, because apart from those people, like we all know, Manchester United, Chelsea, etc., who and Arsenal, who dominate and will always dominate football, we get teams every now and then who come from nowhere, and these teams, whether they be Leeds or let's go back to Brian Clough's teams, Nottingham Forest, Derby, they start off as provincial, unglamorous, teams who are going nowhere, and something happens that changes them, and they become not just good teams, great teams. And I think we can all look back in our history and say, I remember having that great team. Maybe Wolves fans will say, do you remember in the 50s we dominated English football? You can always, whether you're from say Nottingham Forest, we won 2 European Cups. How unbelievable is that? My story is that it was unbelievable for a team like Leeds, who had done nothing up until 1965. They'd been in existence, for about 60, 70 years. Suddenly, they were transformed into one of the most feared teams in Europe, possibly the world. So the story I'm telling is about that journey.
Okay, I mean, it's quite. Leeds is a glamorous city now, and it's a reinvented northern city.
Yeah.
It's quite hard to think back and the kind of the gloom and the grime and the the red brick of the 1970s. But actually, when your story sort of begins in the book, Leeds was quite a glamorous city. It had the super whites.
Yeah. Oh, so, yeah.
It had the ring road. It had a big Olympic pool. It had the futuristic Yorkshire Evening Post building, and it kind of felt like a modern city,
Well, it was the New Jerusalem. I know it's hard to believe now, Steve, but all those things came under the sort of phrase motorway city of the 70s, as though that's a good thing.
Yeah.
Well, back then, these things like inner ring roads and shopping malls and the kind of things that you're talking about were considered to be glamorous, forward-looking, and also very modern. Something went wrong in the 1970s, and this is where I think this is a theme to do with Leeds, but also to do with society. What did go wrong? David Peace, who wrote The Damned United, has mined this area in football, in society, and he's looked at the mid-70s when what you're describing came crashing down, and we suddenly realised that we were actually living in, for want of a better word, a kind of concrete nightmare. And I thought that when I left Leeds in the mid-70s, it would never get better. It would never get back to the glory years of the Reevy side, and also the Leeds that I think was very inspiring in the 60s and 70s.
Yeah.
Then the 90s came, and there was a a regeneration in the north, but there was a resurgence of not just the team but the city again. Harvey Nichols came to Leeds. We in Leeds became a kind of financial and legal centre. We stopped making things, manufacturing ended, but we started to become a service economy, and I think it was reflected in the way the team changed, the ownership of the team, and the way that football changed. We've got football today in a very different position from the 1960s and 70s. My fear is that it could all come crashing down again, and that what you call a glitzy Leeds itself could also be on the verge of crashing. Because if you go a few miles outside of Harvey Nicks, you still come across, you know, impoverishment, crime, these kind of estates where it's a bit like Shameless, really. There's no hope.
Yeah, it's quite true. And also, you know, if you walk the other way from the station, if you walk not towards Ellen Road,
yeah,
but walk the other way, and you'll come across thousands and thousands of beautiful new flats that have been erected, as they've been erected in, you know, my home city of Manchester,
yeah,
more or less any northern city that's been up for reinvention, and all those flats are now empty as the property boom comes around us. I think from this, you know, if you're listening now, you've probably ascertained that this isn't a football book that's particularly about football. It's about society and, yeah, football's place in society and everything. And I guess one of the most fascinating things about the book, for people that don't know, is that it's written from a perspective of a young Jewish fan.
Yeah.
But Leeds United was a club that was associated in the 1980s with horrendous racism, yeah, and terrorist trouble. Was really at, yeah, that time, it was a very Jewish club, wasn't it?
Well, this is the secret history of Leeds United. I haven't really thought it mattered before. I don't know why. It was, to me, you know, it doesn't matter whether you're Jewish, Catholic, you know, Islam. It doesn't really matter at all until you start to look at how the football club changed and the city changed. And it's fascinating then, because what happened in the 60s was that outsiders like the Jewish community and outsiders, if you like, from the Afro-Caribbean community. I mean, the first black player to play in an FA Cup final was Albert Johannesson, Leeds United, 1965. The first club to have Jewish directors were Leeds United, you know, top club I'm talking about. So what I'm trying to argue here is that there's a kind of secret history which is very rarely talked about, because you know, we see Leeds in the way you've described it as a very sort of white working class homogenous community, whereas my experience has always been it's been a melting pot. For example, I know this isn't quite the same, but the Scottish involvement in Leeds has been astonishing over the years. You know, people think about Billy Bremner and so on, Gordon Strachan, Bobby Collins. You know, Leeds have always, from Collins, Bremner, Strachan, they've had these amazing Scots. Now, it's not just the odd individual, but there was a sort of Scottish migration to Leeds, as there were, you know, it was to, you know, Manchester and a lot of places. I mean, what you had was 17 Scottish players in Don Reevy's squad. I know that's unbelievable, but at one point that was true. Think of the Scotland teams that were in the World Cup in 1974, 1978. Half of them, or maybe 60-70% of the first team was Leeds. You know,
yeah,
Bremner,
at least until they were sent home in disgrace. You know, but
and Billy and Jimmy Johnson were.
Yeah,
but, you know,
sure, yeah.
Billy Bremner, Eddie Gray, Peter Lorimer, David Harvey, Joe Jordan, Gordon McQueen. You know, you've only got a few players left after that in the Scotland first team. So what I'm saying is, rather than stick to the stereotype view of the Yorkshireman being, you know, very kind of almost, well, bigoted, and if we were to sort of put it very badly, racist, and I know that there is an element of racism which has always been there and which came to the fore, as you said, in the 80s. I do not shy away from that. To me, it was an appalling period, but I also think there's another story to be told, and a more positive story that should be celebrated.
Yeah, I mean, one of the interesting things about reading this book, and it's a period of football that I remember, but I remember it very hazily, is I think if you've read The Damned United, and particularly if you've seen the film of The Damned United, and you've sort of bought into the ethos of dirty Leeds, yeah, you're describing when you first start going regularly to Ellen Road. and it's a kind of a zenith of the Revie team, and it is kind of in the period just before the events of the Dam United. So Brian Clough's still at Derby, Revie's still ruling the roost. But you say in that book that by that period, by what I'm guessing 71, 70, that Leeds were no longer a dirty team. They put that behind them, you know.
Absolutely. I mean, to me, an alternative to this title, Promised Land, could have been, you know, The Beautiful or The Damned, because basically David's book, which is magnificent, was turned into a film which has sort of reinforced the stereotype that Leeds were kind of almost the devil's incarnate, you know, that there was this sinister, evil side. Now, I'm arguing that in the last 5 years of Don Revie's great side, rather than that, maybe in the first 5 years there was gamesmanship, cynicism, there was a kind of physicality which a lot of people, and brutality that a lot of people thought was destroying the innocence of the game. In the last 5 years, Leeds were Real Madrid, they were Barcelona of today, they were Ajax, they were all these teams rolled into one. And if you think I'm being completely, you know, deluded, read any of the great football writers of the time, and they said the same, and they will still say the same now. I'm not simply being a fan with a typewriter here, or a fan with a laptop. I'm actually expressing what was, you know, in my view, a kind of footballing heaven. When we beat Southampton 7-0 with those 32 passes in a row, you know, when we beat Manchester United 5-1, Nottingham Forest 6-1, I mean, those were 3 games in succession. Leeds played the kind of football that, you know, Johan Cruyff and people like that were extolling at the time. It was a beautiful football which brought the moniker Super Leeds. My view is that Super Leeds took over from Dirty Leeds for the last 5 years of Don Revie's much maligned reign. And if you see The Damned United, the film, you'll think they were brutal.
Right up till the moment he turned up and obviously said you've won it all by cheating and throw your medals in the bin. Let's come up to date a little bit now before we sort of go back and talk more about the book. And you know, I think the sort of demise of Leeds United over the last few years has kind of, maybe because of this perception we have of dirty Leeds and everything, it's been greeted with almost universal hilarity by everybody else, hasn't it? In a way, that, you know, the demise of when City went down a couple of divisions, apart from for United fans, wasn't really, when Sheffield Wednesday have had all their travails over the years, even when Newcastle went down, you know, there was minor rejoicing, but not the kind of thing. Is the
national celebration?
Yeah, do people still hate Leeds United, and do people in Leeds still feel hated? And
well, I think the simple answer to that is yes. I think Leeds are the most hated team in English football. There was a poll a year ago which, you know, actually confirmed this. And yet, a year ago, you know, Leeds were in the old third division. You're thinking, how can a team in the old third division be the most hated team in English football? I think the obvious, I mean, more complex answer to your question is Leeds United have got an aura, and that aura was reinforced by the Damned United. I mean, despite the negative way that they were portrayed in the film, what other football team, you know, would have a film made about them that would be so successful? You know, maybe you go back to the great Arsenal Stadium mystery in the 1930s, perhaps. Although, believe it or not, their manager Herbert Chapman had actually started his career at Leeds. But what I'm claiming, I suppose, in this is that the story of Leeds is a lot more complex than people like to portray. I know I'm a journalist and I sort of like to look at simplicities, and it's so easy to talk about, I don't know, boring Arsenal. You know, well, funnily enough, boring Arsenal transformed their image under Arsene Wenger, didn't they? So we don't today. I mean, the Arsenal crowd every now and then will sing boring Arsenal, ironically. Now, for me, the transformation that took place, you know, when Revie went from Dirty Leeds to Super Leeds, and even, you know, when Howard Wilkinson's side had players like Strachan, McAllister, Speed, Dorigo, flair players winning the title, and then when O'Leary had these young, brilliant players like Kuehl, Woodgate, Paul Robinson, and so on, I don't understand why the old image wasn't transformed, you know, into the new image. How come Arsenal could successfully negotiate their transformation or metamorphosis? from boring Arsenal into, beautiful Arsenal. I don't really know what the answer is, apart from in Leeds we think it's a conspiracy. We think everyone down south, there's a plot against Leeds, that everyone hates us, and we kind of get off on that.
Yeah.
I don't get off on it. I would actually like Leeds to be loved. I mean, I would like Leeds to be admired and to be respected. And for a minute, when we beat Man United 1-0 in the FA Cup in January, I think Leeds were. I mean, everybody was saying, yeah, this is a great, passionate team that's taking on the big guns. And maybe when we're underdogs, people like us, but when we get into a position of power, people hate us.
Yeah, I mean, I would guess that O'Leary team, and that the foundations of that team had been laid by, well, first Graham, but more importantly probably Paul Hart and the people who've been working at Thorpe Arch to bring the kids through in the academy. When they came through, it was really hard not to like them, and then of course you had the Bowyer and Woodgate trial,
well,
and then suddenly, then it all went wrong for Leeds.
But that's the story, that's the narrative of Leeds. You might say you're a City fan. In fact, I know a lot of City fans always say that, what we do is we nearly get there, and then we self-destruct or we implode. And I think maybe it's not unique to Leeds. I mean, I think Leeds, like that O'Leary side, were so close to becoming not just successful, but universally admired, and then they blew it. My argument is that we shouldn't blame outside forces. We shouldn't say the southern media. We shouldn't say, biased referees. We should say, what did we do wrong? What mistakes did we make? What decisions were wrong? And you know what? I think very often we're to blame, and it's down to not just a bad decision or a bad bit of judgment. It's down to a lack of self-belief. I think we don't quite have the same ruthless desire that, say, Manchester United have or Liverpool had in the 80s, because Leeds should have cleaned up, really. Revy's side, however brilliant they were, reached 11 finals, but only won 4. They lost 7. So what is it that stops Leeds really getting into the promised land? And I think it's something not just to do with the football club, but the mentality in what I think the West Riding of Yorkshire. And it's an interesting one, really, because it's not a northern thing. I think of the swaggering, if you don't mind me saying so, Manchester kind of way of looking at things, which is expressed through music, Oasis, that amazing Manchester scene that came through, and still, and I love a lot of Manchester music. I think of the amazing Liverpool kind of self-confidence from the Beatles, through Alan Bleasdale, Willie Russell and so on. Why in Leeds? I think we have similar creative talent. We have Alan Bennett, Keith Waterhouse, we have David Peace. Why? We have amazing football teams. Why do we not bang our own drum? Why don't we blow our own trumpets? Why don't we shout it from the rooftops? There's something about Leeds that stops us doing that.
Yeah, I mean, they've rarely had a band to kind of, or a scene to kind of hang it on, haven't they? I think there was that whole kind of goth thing at the sort of mid 80s, which was quite. I imagine that would be quite hard to relate to on the terrace. There were not many people singing the Sisters of Mercy on the.
Exactly, but how it's interesting you say that, because the scene. I mean, from the Hacienda through the Smiths and New Order and Stone Roses up to the present day Manchester. I mean, it's not just a scene. It feels like you've had like 30 years of amazing Manchester music. But for Leeds, you get the odd band like Kaiser Chiefs, or even Scritti Politti, who I love. But it's the odd band. They come through and they're kind of. They've got a chip on their shoulder and they're kind of going against the grain. And I think it's interesting to me that there isn't a scene in Leeds, and yet there's a collection of individuals. For example, writers. Let's take the writers. Liverpool, you think of the beat poets, Roger McGough, Adrian Henry, people like that. Leeds have Alan Bennett, Keith Waterhouse, Willis Hall, David Storey. None of them became part of a group. They're all individuals. They didn't want to. It's like Groucho Marx once said, I don't want to belong to any club that would have me for a member. And I think there's this thing about Leeds that doesn't really want to. We're not clubbable,
Yeah. And I mean, at the moment, as we speak at the moment, obviously people are going to download this and listen to this over a long period of time. But the season's just started. It's looking reasonably good for Leeds. They lost the first game to Derby deservedly, but they've come on well since then. Things are looking good at the ground. Is Ken Bates a good chairman? It's quite, you know.
I actually think that Simon Grayson is a great manager, and I think that we've got a lot of players, some of whom are local and homegrown, you know, like Johnny Howson, Richard Naylor, and others who are very exciting young players. I think we've got a very, very good team now, and the main thing I'd say about Leeds, Steve, is we've got the passion of the fans. I mean, the atmosphere at Ellen Road is wonderful again, and I think that's a real boost to the team. So whoever was the chairman couldn't go wrong as far as I'm concerned. But whatever you think of Ken Bates, and in the book, you know, again, I don't gloss over that he has this image which some people don't particularly like, but he did turn it around. I mean, I think that the debts that we had are no longer there. Now, there are question marks, obviously, about, you know, who owns Leeds.
Who actually owns the club, yeah.
I'm not going to get into that, but, you know, what I would say is, if Leeds carry on at winning and playing the kind of football that they're playing, you know, fans won't mind, won't bother about that. I think all that matters is that they get back into the Premier League. The other question, though, I think, which needs to be asked is, you know, if they get back into the Premier League, will they ever get back to the kind of the heights that they once, you know, were at? Now, I'm not too sure about that, because I actually am a bit pessimistic. I think that the golden days are over, and the days when a team like Leeds could actually get into the top four. I don't think any team now, you know, occasionally you get a Tottenham or you get an Everton for a year or two break in, but really the way football's changed now, I think it's virtually impossible, and I think that's a sad reflection, really.
Yeah, it is very sad, you know, and it's very sad that, as we've said in these podcasts with I think we were saying this only last week with Tony Parsons, that, you know, it means much more. He would be much more excited if the best manager in the world became available and said he was joining your club tomorrow and he was bringing the best 3 players in the world with him. It would be much less exciting than if Sheikh Mansour said he was the richest man in the world, said he was buying your club, and that's a kind of a sad reflection on kind of where we are.
Absolutely.
If they did go up, would they be able to stay up? Who are the players that, I mean, you know, people watch the Premiership, man.
I know.
The Premier League. Who are the guys that we should be looking for? Who are the guys that you're excited by?
The one player I really like is Johnny Howson, who stood on the Kop at Leeds as a kid, and, you know, he plays with his heart, but he's got a fantastic football brain, to use the phrase that Alan Hansen seems to like. I love watching Johnny Howson. I also think that at the moment we've got this new guy Sommer who's come through, and when Jermaine Beckford went to Everton and people said you need to replace him, well, we seem to have replaced him. I mean, Sommer came on, scored 2 goals to beat Millwall 3-1, scored in the next game. Billy Painters hasn't played for Leeds yet, but he's a striker who'll get you 20 goals in the season. I also like a very underrated player in midfield, Kilkenny, who doesn't get a lot of the praise, but Kilkenny had a magnificent game against Manchester United, you know, when they beat them 1-0. I also think that in defence we've now got you know, Alex Bruce, and I think you know, having watched him at Ipswich, I was very impressed with Alex Bruce. I think he could be the answer to our defensive problems. But can I just finish by saying the best player we've got at the moment, the most exciting player we've had for years, is the goalkeeper, and that's, now this is a terrible phrase, but some Leeds fans have called him son of scum, which is horrible. I would not endorse that. It's Kasper Schmeichel, who's the son of Peter, and it's funny how we've got a sort of the sons of the old Manchester United players who we supposedly hate, like Alex Bruce, son of Steve. So Kasper Schmeichel is a man who could well get us into the Premier League. He's been playing superbly well in every single game. He's a fantastic character, and his whole attitude is very Leeds. You know, the fans love him, even though, you know, his dad played for Manchester United.
Yeah. I mean, those Leeds versus United feelings do run very deep. And I do remember when I was doing a lot of work in Leeds, there was a guy who used to turn up in the pubs at Leeds, and he used to turn up at Ellen Road every other Saturday, and he used to wear a Manchester United shirt with number 7 on the back, and when people would point to him and go, "What are you doing?" he'd point to the back, and he'd have the lettering scum put on the back. So it was an Eric Cantona, you know, Judas Scum T-shirt, and I don't think the fella ever bought a pint, you know. What was the absolute worst moment, and And as a journalist who has to write about Leeds United, how hard is it to be objective when you do that?
Well, to combine those two points, my worst moment was when I was in Leeds. I must explain that I've lived away from Leeds for 20 odd years, but I always go back to see my family. And I was driving along and heard the 1 o'clock news on the radio, and it was that the Bowyer Woodgate trial had collapsed because of a report in the Sunday Mirror, and I almost crashed my car because I was
not in an Ashley Cole style either, obviously.
But I thought, first of all, on three levels it was bad. It was bad because Leeds United, if the trial had collapsed, it would just be terrible. The stress and the strain of what they had to go through, and the shame of what was coming out because of the nature of Bowyer and Woodgate's involvement in what was an attack on a student. Secondly, I thought I'd written the piece that had caused the trial to collapse. I hadn't, thank God. But thirdly, my newspaper, the Sunday Mirror, suddenly was banned from Ellen Road because of that. So the worst moment, you talked about the zenith, but the nadir would be the Bowyer Woodgate trial, which brought back all the kind of old accusations of racism and so on. It was a terrible time for Leeds, and I thought at that point there would be no coming back from that. But we came back because although it took a long time, it took about 10 years, we came back and we eventually became a team that could be proud of our not just our club and our city, but I call it the tradition of integration and integrating the communities. What I didn't like about that was that the Jewish community integrated. I was there, I knew what had happened, I felt integrated through football. What I felt sad was that the Asian community was not being integrated but being alienated by that Bowyer Woodgate affair.
Yeah.
And I still think there's an element of alienation. I really want the Asian community to love Leeds the way that the Jewish community love Leeds. And who knows, maybe the next generation will, because the drive and enthusiasm in the Asian community is similar to the drive and enthusiasm in the Leeds Jewish community that helped Leeds, the city and the club, in the 60s and 70s.
So I mean, that's one possible future, for Leeds United. I think it's a future that a lot of clubs in those towns are looking for and those cities are looking for. Just to wrap it up then, I mean, the book is sensational. Again, go and buy it. It's called Promised Land: The Reinvention of Leeds United. You mentioned right up at the top that Leeds is a city that's always fighting for acceptance. Is that? Do you think Leeds and Leeds United are doomed into this
Yes.
kind of death spiral?
I do. I really do. And that's, Leeds is a schizophrenic city, and we have this fantastic fighting spirit, this sort of, we'll come back from the dead, expressed by the fact that when we were in the old third division for 3 years, we would sing, "We're not famous, we're not famous, we're not famous anymore." Now that to me just sums it up, this kind of tongue-in-cheek, self-effacing, taking the mickey out of ourselves. But what we love, is when we're fighting, when we're up against adversity, when we are fighting against the elite, when the chips are down, when we get, 15 points deducted. That season, do you remember that?
Yeah.
Beginning of the season, Leeds got 15 points deducted. Do you know what? They won their first 8 games. Now that spirit is very Leeds, but the flip side of that is what happens when we get to the top, when we get to a final, when we get to a playoff final or an FA Cup final. Very often we don't show up, we implode, we choke, and this is the schizophrenia that is Leeds.
Excellent. Thank you very much to Anthony Clavane. We'll be back next week with another 3 p.m. podcast from mirrorfootball.co.uk. You can listen on the site, you can download from iTunes, or check us out on YouTube. See you next week.